Richard Bennett is a man who built everything, except a family. A 50-year-old millionaire CEO in Houston, he runs a real estate empire from his glass-walled penthouse. But his heart is surrounded by silence. One rainy afternoon, stuck at a red light, Richard sees two twin boys wiping windshields. He's about to look away, until one face meets his, and it's like looking in a mirror. Who are these boys? Why do they look like him? And why does the name of their sick mother sound painfully familiar? Haunted by the past and drawn to a truth he never expected, Richard embarks on a journey of love, regret, and redemption that could either heal his soul or shatter what little peace he has left. Stay until the end to witness a twist that will redefine the meaning of family. Subscribe now for more stories that move your heart and restore your hope. The storm hadn't let up all afternoon. Rain lashed against the windows of the black Escalade as it rolled to a stop at the corner of Richmond and Main, the city of Houston blurring under a gray veil. Inside the vehicle, Richard Bennett leaned back in the leather seat, his phone glowing with unread messages. The board wanted numbers. The press wanted statements. But, for a rare moment, the millionaire CEO let the silence between emails linger. He stared blankly out the window, his reflection ghosted on the glass. 50 years old, founder of one of Texas's largest real estate empires. Alone. Successful, but alone. The driver's voice broke through the hum of the rain. "Light's red, sir. Might be a few minutes." Richard barely nodded. He wasn't in a hurry. Not today. Not anymore. Then, from the corner of his eye, he saw them. Two boys, maybe 9 or 10, darted between puddles and traffic with a squeaky bottle of window cleaner and a wadded towel. They were drenched to the bone, the rain soaking through their mismatched jackets, sneakers squishing with every step. One approached the Escalade with hesitant determination. Richard instinctively waved him off, but the boy was already at the window, lifting the rag. And then he froze. Richard blinked, leaning forward slightly. Something about the boy's face, his jawline, the angle of his brow, the steady eyes that met his, made his chest tighten unexpectedly. It wasn't just resemblance, it was recognition. He rolled the window down halfway. Cold air swept in. "What's your name, son?" Richard asked quietly, unsure why his voice had gone so soft. The boy paused, suspicious, then answered, "Jaden." "And your brother?" "Jacob," came a smaller voice from the other side of the SUV. "We're twins." Richard looked between them, heart thudding. Same shaped face, same dark, straight hair, same, God help him, hazel eyes flecked with green, just like his. "You boys out here alone?" he asked. Jaden nodded. "Our mom's sick. We're just trying to make some money for her medicine." The driver turned slightly in his seat. "Want me to call someone?" "No," Richard said quickly, sharper than he meant to. Then, to the boys more gently, "Where do you live?" Jaden hesitated. "Not far. Near the old motel on Eastwood." Richard's stomach twisted. That part of town was barely standing. He'd demolished a few properties near there himself during his early expansion days. No place for children. He reached into his wallet and pulled out a $100 bill. "Take this. Get inside. You shouldn't be out in this weather." Jaden didn't move. "We don't take charity." Richard studied the boy's face. His face, 20 years younger. The fierce independence, the refusal to be pitied. It struck something raw in him. "It's not charity," he said. "It's payment. For cleaning the windows." Jacob perked up. "Even though we didn't finish?" Richard forced a smile. "Especially because of that." Jaden finally reached out, fingers trembling slightly as he took the bill. "Thank you, sir." As the light turned green, the driver asked, "We moving?" Richard didn't answer right away. His gaze lingered on the retreating backs of the boys, their small figures swallowed by the downpour. He exhaled shakily. "Drive slowly," he murmured. "I need to make a call." The boys had said their mother was sick, lived by Eastwood. Their names were Jaden and Jacob. And that face he saw every morning in the mirror. He tapped his phone and he called his longtime assistant. "Kara, I need a background check. 2 boys, Jaden and Jacob, living near the Eastwood Motel. Mother possibly ill. No father mentioned." There was a long pause on the other end. "Richard, is everything okay?" He looked out of the window again, the rain still streaking down. "No," he said honestly, "but I think I need to find out the truth." He ended the call and leaned back, staring into the blur of water and light outside. His mind flashed to Natalie. Her laugh, her stubbornness, her sudden disappearance from his life all those years ago. He hadn't heard from her since. Not after the fight, not after the accusations, and definitely not after his family's pressure had driven her away, and now 2 boys, twins, with his eyes. A lump formed in his throat. Could it be? He didn't have answers yet, but he knew one thing with quiet certainty. He wasn't going to let this mystery slip away. Not this time. The Escalade pulled into the underground garage of a Richard Bennett's downtown penthouse just as the rain eased into a dull drizzle. He stepped out slowly, like a man whose axis had been tilted, briefcase forgotten in the back seat. He didn't head straight for the elevator. Instead, he stood still for a moment, staring at the slick pavement, hearing the faint echo of twin voices in his mind. "Our mom's sick. We don't take charity." By the time he reached the 31st floor, Richard had already made 2 more calls, one to Kara, requesting anything she could find on a Natalie Williams with 2 sons, and another to his private investigator, Marcus Trent. If anyone could untangle the past, it was Marcus. The penthouse was pristine, cold, and quiet. He used to like that. Now the silence scraped against his nerves. He loosened his tie, poured a glass of scotch, and stood by the window overlooking Houston's skyline. But the lights didn't comfort him like they usually did. He saw Jacob's eyes again. His eyes. A soft ping broke the stillness. A text from Kara. Natalie Williams, age 47, last known residence, Sunset Grove Motel, Eastwood. No employer on record. 2 minor dependents, Jaden and Jacob Williams. Hospital visit logged 2 weeks ago. Possible respiratory illness. Richard sat down heavily on the leather couch. Natalie. He hadn't spoken her name aloud in nearly a decade. Not since the night she left, heartbroken, after his silence had sealed the space between them, his family's disapproval, his pride, his fear. He took a deep breath, reached for his phone, and dialed Marcus. "I need you to confirm a few things," Richard said, his voice low. "Natalie Williams, Eastwood, 2 boys, twins. I think they might be mine." There was a brief silence. "You sure about that?" "No," Richard admitted, exhaling shakily. "But I've never been more afraid that I might be." He didn't sleep that night. By morning, the city had shed its stormy skin, and the sun broke weakly through gray clouds. Richard didn't wait for Marcus's report. He drove himself, something he hadn't done in years, through Houston traffic until he reached Eastwood. The neighborhood looked just as he remembered it in the worst ways. Peeling paint, boarded-up windows, a faded playground swallowed by weeds. He parked across the street from Sunset Grove, a tired 2-story building that sagged in defeat. Room 207. The woman at the front desk eyed him with suspicion but said nothing as he walked past. He knocked softly at first. No answer. Then harder. He was about to turn away when the door cracked open. Natalie. She looked smaller than he remembered, her once fiery hair dulled, eyes tired, wrapped in a blanket that barely concealed the tremble in her frame, but when she saw him, her face changed. A breath caught in her throat. "Richard?" He swallowed. "Hey." She stepped back, uncertain. "Why are you here?" He hesitated. "I saw them. The boys." Her expression fell. "You weren't supposed to." "I know." His voice cracked. "But I did." She leaned heavily against the doorframe. "They don't know who you are." Richard nodded, chest tightening. "I figured. But Natalie, they look—" His voice broke again. "They look just like me." Silence stretched between them, a decade's worth of questions hanging in the air. "You made it clear back then," she said quietly, bitterly. "Your family made it even clearer." "I was scared," Richard said, ashamed, "and stupid, and I thought you left because it was easier." Natalie looked away. "I left because I had no choice." Another long pause. "I want to help," he said earnestly. "With the boys, with you." She looked back at him, exhausted but defiant. "Why now?" "Because I can't unsee them," he said truthfully. "Because I don't want to run from this again." She didn't respond right away. Then, with a tired sigh, she opened the door wider. Inside, the room was small. 2 twin beds, a broken lamp, and barely enough space to breathe. Jaden and Jacob were curled up on the bed, sleeping, still wearing the clothes they'd had on the day before. Richard stared at them, heart pounding. His sons. Natalie noticed the shift in his gaze. "I didn't want to tell them unless I had to." "I understand." "No," she said firmly. "I need you to understand this too. You don't get to come in and out, Richard. If you're going to be part of their lives, it has to be real. Consistent. They've only known disappointment." He nodded solemnly. "I'm not going anywhere." Natalie studied him for a long moment, then sat down slowly at the edge of the bed. "They deserve the truth, but not today. They're tired. I'm tired. Can I help?" he asked softly. She looked up at him, and for the first time since he arrived, her eyes softened. Just a little. "You can go get some groceries," she said with a faint smile. "We haven't had a proper breakfast in days." Richard smiled back, gently, hopefully. "I can do that." And, as he stepped outside into the morning light, a strange sensation settled in his chest. Something almost forgotten. Responsibility. Hope. Maybe even the beginning of redemption. The grocery bags rustled as Richard stepped back into the motel room. He wasn't sure what food 2 9-year-olds liked, so he'd grabbed everything from cereal and frozen waffles to applesauce and chocolate milk. The room was still dim, the blinds half closed against the gray morning light. Natalie was now propped against a pillow, clearly struggling to mask the fatigue that clung to her like a second skin. "I didn't know if they're picky eaters," Richard said gently, setting the bags on the cracked counter near the microwave. "So, I overdid it." Natalie let out a quiet, breathy laugh. "They'll eat anything sweet. You've already won them over with the chocolate milk." The boys stirred as the smell of warm waffles filled the air. Richard clumsily operated the tiny microwave, his movements stiff but determined. He wasn't used to this. He didn't know what a father was supposed to do, but the silence from the bed behind him was less hostile now, maybe even curious. "Jaden," Natalie called softly, rousing one of the twins. The boy sat up groggily, rubbing his eyes. When he spotted Richard at the counter, he blinked hard, like trying to remember if last night had been a dream. "Morning," Richard said awkwardly. "Hi," Jaden replied, glancing toward his mom. "It's okay," she murmured. Jacob stirred next, yawning as he rolled over. When both boys sat up and looked at Richard, he felt the weight of their gaze. Not suspicion exactly, but wariness. "You guys like waffles?" he asked. Jacob nodded. "With syrup?" "I brought the kind in the little bear bottle," Richard said with a faint grin. That got a small smile from both boys. They shuffled over in socked feet, sat at the small table by the window, and waited quietly as he prepared their breakfast. Natalie watched from the bed, her expression unreadable. She hadn't said much more since their conversation that morning, but something had shifted, an invisible truce, fragile and new. As the boys dug into their food, Richard leaned against the edge of the counter. "I can stay for a bit, if you're okay with that." Natalie hesitated. "They'll have questions. Maybe not today, but soon." "I'll answer them," he said quietly, honestly. She nodded once. "Okay." After breakfast, the boys began showing him their drawings, scribbles of superheroes, rocket ships, and dragons. Richard crouched beside the table, genuinely amazed by the creativity in their messy, crumpled notebooks. "You drew this?" he asked, pointing to a picture of a tall man holding hands with two kids under a sun with a face. Jaden shrugged. "Yeah, we like to draw when Mom's resting." "Is that your dad?" Richard asked, careful with his tone. Jacob looked at his brother, then back at Richard. "We don't have one." The words cut sharper than Richard expected. "I mean, not really," Jaden added quickly. "Mom says it's just been the three of us." Natalie turned her face toward the wall, eyes fluttering shut. Richard nodded slowly. "I see." Jacob tilted his head. "You talk kind of like our mom." "Oh yeah?" Richard smiled, surprised. "She reads a lot too," Jaden said, "and she makes us say thank you even for broccoli." "That sounds like a smart rule." The rest of the day passed in a strange sort of rhythm. Richard went out briefly to get children's Tylenol and more groceries. When he returned, he found Jacob curled up next to his mother, his head on her shoulder, while Jaden sat beside her reading aloud from a book about sea creatures. Richard watched them from the doorway, heart aching in places he hadn't felt in years. Later that evening, after the boys were asleep, Natalie motioned for him to sit in the chair near the bed. "They're yours," she said plainly. Her voice wasn't bitter or dramatic, just honest. Richard swallowed hard, his eyes locking on hers. "I knew it the moment I saw them." "I didn't know I was pregnant when we split," she said softly. "I tried to reach out 6 months later, but your assistant, she said you were too busy. She told me you'd moved on." "I never got the messages," he said, leaning forward. "I swear." "I believe you now," she said quietly, then coughed into her elbow. Her voice was thinner when she spoke again. "I didn't want to disrupt your life. I just wanted to keep them safe." "You did more than that," Richard replied, emotion tightening his throat. "You raised two incredible boys." Natalie looked away. "I'm not sure how much longer I can keep doing it." He stood, walked over, and gently placed a hand on hers. "You don't have to anymore. Let me help, Nat. Let me make up for the time I lost." She looked up at him, eyes shimmering. "They deserve better than a maybe." "I'm not a maybe," he said, voice steady. "Not this time." She exhaled slowly, nodding. "Then start by being here in the morning. They'll want pancakes." He smiled. "Then pancakes they'll have." Outside the window, the Houston night stretched vast and uncertain. But inside that tiny motel room, something had shifted. Something vital and quietly miraculous. A family was beginning to take shape. The sunlight poured through the motel window the next morning, painting soft stripes across the threadbare carpet. The tiny room still smelled faintly of syrup and laundry detergent, a combination oddly comforting to Richard as he stood near the counter, flipping pancakes on a griddle he had rushed out to buy at dawn. His sleeves were rolled up, his tie was forgotten, and, for the first time in years, his phone was silent. "Are those for us?" Jacob's voice was soft but hopeful as he tiptoed toward the kitchenette, rubbing his eyes. Richard turned and offered a lopsided smile. "Only if you like chocolate chip pancakes." The boy's eyes lit up. "I love them!" From behind came Jaden's voice, groggy but awake. "Mom usually burns them." Richard chuckled. sliding a golden stack onto two mismatched plates. "Then we're aiming for a small miracle today." The boys sat cross-legged at the table, digging in with unrestrained joy. Natalie stirred weakly in bed, her face pale but peaceful as she watched them. Richard crossed over with a third plate, plain pancakes with a drizzle of honey, and crouched beside her. "You need strength," he said gently, placing the plate on the nightstand. "I need a new pair of lungs," she replied, managing a faint smirk. Richard hesitated. "I've already arranged for you to be transferred this afternoon. Houston Medical. Best pulmonary care in the state." Her smile faded. "Richard?" "No," he interrupted softly but firmly. "You don't get to fight me on this. Not anymore. You're not alone." Tears welled up in her eyes. She turned away quickly, nodding. That afternoon, while Natalie was transported to the hospital, Richard brought the twins back to his penthouse for the first time. The elevator doors opened to reveal a pristine, modern space, cold, immaculate, and painfully silent. The boys stepped inside cautiously, their sneakers squeaking against the marble. "Whoa," Jacob whispered. Jaden frowned, his eyes scanning the high ceilings and glass walls. "It's kinda lonely." Richard felt a pang in his chest. He hadn't realized how sterile his life had become until it was reflected through a child's eyes. "Well," he said carefully, "maybe we can change that." The boys explored like cautious explorers, peeking into guest rooms, marveling at the automated blinds, whispering to each other about the infinity tub and the TV the size of a wall. Richard followed behind them, watching closely, wondering how he'd missed out on 9 years of these small moments. "I thought penthouses had video game rooms," Jacob said, half joking. Richard cleared his throat. "Give me a day. I'll fix that." They laughed, and for the first time, the echo that followed felt less empty. As evening approached, Richard tried to make spaghetti, his first attempt at cooking in years. The noodles clumped, the sauce was watery, but the twins ate every bite without complaint. "You're better than the school lunches," Jaden declared with a proud nod. Richard grinned, absurdly flattered. That night, after stories and a not-so-great attempt at lullabies, the boys finally drifted off in the guest room Richard had frantically redecorated with superhero posters and new bedding. He stood in the doorway for a long time, watching them breathe, listening to their small snores. Then he stepped back into the quiet hallway, suddenly aware of how exhausted he was. His phone buzzed. It was the doctor from Houston Medical. "Mr. Bennett, Natalie's stable, but her condition is serious. We'll need to start a more aggressive treatment plan immediately." Richard exhaled slowly. "Do whatever it takes. Money isn't a concern." After the call, he returned to the living room, sank into the leather sofa, and stared out at the glittering Houston skyline. It looked the same as it had the night before, but everything had changed. 9 years ago, he had let fear and pride dictate his actions. He had let go of the woman he loved because he believed he was protecting her, but in doing so, he'd abandoned something far greater than he realized. Now he had a chance, no, a responsibility, to put it right. The apartment, once sterile and lonely, now held the sound of laughter muffled behind bedroom walls. Pancake batter crusted the stove. A superhero cape hung off a dining chair. And, on the coffee table, drawn in crayon on a piece of printer paper, was a picture. It showed 3 stick figures, 2 little boys and a man with gray hair. Above it, in uneven handwriting, were the words, "Me, Jacob, and maybe our dad." Richard pressed the paper to his chest, emotions swelling painfully. He wasn't a maybe anymore. He was here, and he wasn't going anywhere. Richard awoke to the quiet tap of the small feet on the hardwood. The sun had barely crested, the skyline casting the soft orange glow through the penthouse windows. He rubbed his eyes and looked over the edge of the sofa, still in the clothes from the night before, only to see Jacob standing near the kitchen fiddling with the toaster. "I was trying to make you breakfast," Jacob whispered, glancing back nervously. "Like you did for us." Richard sat up slowly, his heart aching at the sight. "That's very kind of you, buddy. But I think we should probably keep you away from appliances until further notice." Jacob grinned sheepishly. "I didn't know how long to toast it." Richard chuckled. "Let's make something together instead. Deal? Deal." 20 minutes later, the two sat at the breakfast bar. Richard with slightly burnt toast, Jacob with a bowl of cereal that had more marshmallows than grain. Across the apartment, Jaden snored gently, buried beneath his superhero comforter. "You know," Richard said, pausing mid-bite, "you remind me of someone I used to know, someone very brave." Jacob tilted his head. "Was she our mom?" Richard's breath caught. He nodded slowly. "Yes, she was." Jacob looked down into his cereal. "She's still really sick, isn't she?" "She is," Richard answered carefully. "But she's getting the best care now." "Do you think she'll get better?" Richard hesitated. "I hope so. And hope is powerful." Later that morning, the boys sat cross-legged on the living room floor, sketching cartoon heroes while Richard reviewed work emails for the first time in days. His assistant had sent a series of increasingly urgent messages about missed calls and press inquiries. Richard skimmed them, barely absorbing the content. He looked over at the boys, laughing now as they argued over whose drawing had more battle power, and realized how little any of that mattered right now. His world was here, and it had taken him too long to find it. The doorbell rang. Richard opened it to find Dr. Allison Tran, the pulmonologist overseeing Natalie's care, standing with a clipboard and tired eyes. "Morning," she said gently, stepping in as Richard motioned her through. He led her into the study and shut the door quietly behind them. "She's stable," Dr. Tran began, "but her condition is progressing faster than we anticipated. We've started a new round of immunotherapy, but—" Richard gripped the edge of the desk. But she doesn't have a lot of time." The air left the room. "How long?" Dr. Tran hesitated. "Maybe weeks, maybe less. She's fighting hard, Mr. Bennett, but you should prepare." He nodded slowly, jaw clenched. "What does she need most right now?" "Peace, stability, time with her boys." Richard closed his eyes. "Then that's exactly what she'll have." Later that day, he brought the twins to the hospital. They each held a bouquet, messy, handmade, and clutched like treasures. When Natalie saw them, her eyes brimmed instantly. "Mom!" Jaden cried, racing to her side. Jacob followed, gently placing his flowers on the nightstand. "We missed you." Natalie pulled them both close, whispering into their hair. Richard stepped back, watching quietly. For a moment, he saw not the frail patient in a hospital gown, but the fierce woman who once challenged him to be more than just another Bennett heir. After a while, Natalie looked up at him. "Thank you," she said softly. Richard sat beside her bed, his voice rough. "I should have been here years ago." She shook her head. "Regret is heavy. Don't give it to them." "I won't." That evening, back at the penthouse, Richard tucked the boys into bed. They were quieter than usual. Jaden clutching a photo of their mother, Jacob curled on his side, staring at the ceiling. "Will she die?" Jacob asked suddenly. Richard sat on the edge of the bed. "She's very sick, but she's strong, and she loves you more than anything in this world." "More than money?" Jaden murmured. Richard's eyes stung. "More than money, more than anything." There was silence, thick and thoughtful. "Are you going to leave too?" Jacob asked. Richard reached for his hand. "No, I'm here now, and I'm not going anywhere." The next morning, as the boys ate waffles and argued about superheroes again, Richard stood in his study staring at a family court application, guardianship, permanent. He picked up the pen and without hesitation signed his name. He had lost a decade. But he wasn't going to lose another day. The kitchen clock ticked past midnight, but Richard was wide awake, seated at the edge of the boys' bunk beds, softly reading a weathered copy of Charlotte's Web. Jaden was already asleep, one arm dangling over the side, his breaths slow and even. But Jacob, with his ever-curious eyes, still stared at the ceiling as Richard's voice filled the quiet room. And Wilbur never forgot Charlotte. He loved her children and grandchildren dearly. Richard's voice caught on the final words. "Is that the end?" Jacob whispered, his voice barely more than a breath. "It is," Richard replied, closing the book slowly. "Some endings are sad, but they still mean love was real." Jacob turned his head. "Is Mom going to be in the end of our story?" Richard blinked hard. "She'll always be part of it, just like Charlotte." The boy nodded slowly, a silent understanding passing between them. Back in the living room, Richard poured himself a glass of water and let out a long breath. The city lights outside the penthouse windows sparkled like distant stars, beautiful but cold. He felt the weight of what he was becoming, not just a benefactor or a caretaker, but something deeper, heavier. A father. The next morning began with chaos. Jacob couldn't find his shoes. Jaden spilled orange juice over a stack of school papers. Richard, in a shirt he hadn't ironed, wrestled with a backpack zipper that refused to cooperate. The once pristine penthouse now looked like a daycare exploded inside a luxury catalog. Yet somehow, it felt alive. He dropped the boys off at their new school with a reassuring squeeze on each shoulder and a quiet, "Be kind. Be curious." As he pulled away from the curb, he caught them in the rearview mirror, two small figures waving with goofy grins and chocolate on their cheeks. That afternoon, Natalie's nurse called with a concerning update. Her pain had increased, and she was struggling to keep food down. Richard canceled his meetings and rushed to the hospital. She looked frailer than before, but her eyes still held fire. "I told you not to baby me," she said, as he adjusted the IV stand beside her bed. "You'd do the same if the roles were reversed," he replied gently. She gave a tired smile. "No, I'd probably throw a pillow at you." It chuckled, then his smile faded. "They asked about you last night, about death, about the end." Natalie's face sobered. "They're smart, too smart for the world they've had to live in. I told them you'd always be part of their story." She reached out, her fingers brushing his hand. "Thank you." "I'm filing for guardianship," he said, steady but emotional. "If something happens—" "When?" she interrupted, not cruelly, just truthfully. He nodded, throat thick. "When it does, I'll be there for them. Not out of guilt, but because they're mine, and I want them." Natalie's eyes welled. "Then let them have you now, while they still have me too." He leaned down and kissed her forehead gently. "They already do." Back at the penthouse, the boys had drawn pictures, stick figures labeled Jaden, Jacob, Mom, and now Dad. Richard stared at the name beside his cartoon version for a long time until Jaden tugged at his sleeve. "Can you help me with math?" Richard sat beside him, staring blankly at the fractions. "I wasn't great at math," he admitted sheepishly. "That's okay," Jacob added from across the table. "Mom says trying is smarter than pretending." He smiled. "Your mom's a wise woman." The moment was interrupted by a sharp knock at the door. Richard opened it to find a man in a sleek gray suit, briefcase in hand, and a smirk too polished to be friendly. "Mr. Bennett," the man said, extending a hand Richard didn't take. "I'm Marcus Dunn. I represent Mr. Leonard Black, Natalie's uncle." Richard's heart clenched. "He's filed for emergency guardianship. He claims familial blood rights and questions your legal standing given your previous abandonment." Richard stared at him, pulse rising. He's the one who forced her out in the first place. I'm just the messenger, Marcus replied coolly. But there will be a court hearing. Soon. Richard shut the door slowly, leaning against it as the boys watched from the kitchen table. Everything okay? Jacob asked, frowning. Richard forced a smile. Yeah, just a visitor I didn't like very much. That night, after the boys had gone to bed, Richard stood on the penthouse balcony, the wind cutting sharply across his face. He had built towers, negotiated billion-dollar deals, faced boardrooms of cutthroat executives. But nothing felt as high stakes, as terrifying as this. He closed his eyes, whispering to the city below, I won't lose them. Not now. Not again. The next morning began with a heavy fog that clung to the streets of Houston like an omen. Richard barely noticed as he brewed coffee, his mind already 1,000 miles away. The words emergency guardianship echoed in his head, as if each syllable carved itself deeper into his thoughts. In the living room, the twins were wrestling over a pencil. Their laughter was loud and unfiltered, a kind of chaos that once would have grated on Richard's nerves. Now, it anchored him. Hey, he called softly, stepping into the room. Can I ask you both something? Jaden immediately turned, still holding the pencil. Jacob looked up from his notebook, his eyes curious. Last night, Richard began slowly, you drew something. That picture with the stick figures. You wrote Dad under mine. Jaden nodded. Yeah, is that okay? Richard knelt, heart thudding. More than okay, but I need to ask. Do you want that to be true? Not just on paper, but in real life? Jacob looked at his brother, then back to Richard. Are you really our dad, Richard? Inhaled deeply. Yes. I didn't know for a long time, but now that I do, I want to be the kind of dad you can count on. The boys exchanged a look, the kind only twins understood. Then Jaden asked cautiously, And you're not going to leave? Never, Richard said firmly. If you'll let me stay. Jacob walked over and, without a word, hugged him. Jaden followed. I guess that means yes, Richard whispered, holding them tightly. Later that day, Richard received a court summons. The hearing was scheduled for Friday. He stood silently by the window, watching traffic snake along the freeway, feeling the weight of history and responsibility closing in. When Natalie saw him later that evening, he tried to hide the stress, but she knew him too well. You're worried, she said, her voice raspy but steady. There's going to be a hearing, he replied. Your uncle's trying to take them. She sighed, her eyes closing briefly. He's never cared about anyone but himself. And now he's going to pretend he suddenly cares about my sons? Richard sat beside her bed, taking her hand gently. He's using my past against me. My silence. My absence. Natalie opened her eyes, glassy but sharp. Then speak now, loudly. At bedtime, Jaden and Jacob each insisted on a different story. Richard tried his best to switch voices, which led to fits of giggles and an impromptu pillow fight. It ended with the three of them on the floor, out of breath, laughing so hard Richard's stomach hurt. In the quiet after, Jaden's voice broke the silence. What if they make us go somewhere else? Richard looked at him earnestly. Then I'll fight for you, with everything I have. Jacob's eyes welled up and he whispered, Promise? I promise, Richard said, sealing it with a pinky swear that Jacob took very seriously. The next morning, Richard met with his attorney, Helen Alvarez, a fiercely intelligent woman with a calm, commanding presence. She sat across from him in a quiet office, reviewing the case file. Black's legal team will argue you're unfit, she said, looking up. That you abandoned Natalie. That you knew and didn't care. I didn't know, Richard said through clenched teeth. And you have to prove that. Not just in paperwork, but in presence. emotion, testimony. I'll do whatever it takes. Helen nodded. Then we start by preparing you to tell the truth. Back at the hospital, Natalie was growing weaker. Her skin was pale, her voice even thinner. "Are they okay?" she asked. "They're asking about you. Every hour, they made cards." She smiled faintly. "They need you, Richard. And not just for the battles in court. I know. I saw it in Jacob's eyes the first night you brought them here. He's been waiting for you his whole life." Richard's heart twisted. "And I've wasted so much time. You still have some left," she whispered. "Use it well." That night, Richard made pancakes. They came out lopsided and slightly burnt, but the boys devoured them like they were gourmet. "You're improving," Jaden said with his mouth full. "Barely," Jacob teased. "I'm taking notes," Richard replied with a smile. When the boys went to bed, Richard sat in the living room, staring at the court documents spread across the table. Among them was a drawing Jacob had done. 3 stick figures labeled Me, Jaden, and Dad. They were holding hands. Outside, the city pulsed with life, but inside this penthouse, Richard realized something powerful. He didn't just want to win the case. He wanted to win their hearts. Forever. By Thursday morning, the calm that had settled in Richard's penthouse felt deceptively fragile, like glass balancing on the edge of a table. The boys had gone off to school with hesitant smiles and crumpled permission slips for a field trip. Richard stood alone in the kitchen, staring at the silent coffee maker, the weight of the upcoming hearing pressing heavily on his chest. The phone rang. "Mr. Bennett." Helen's voice came through, firm but cautious. "You need to see this." Within minutes, Richard was in her office, where the television played a news segment on loop. The headline read, "Real estate tycoon accused of using twins to save image." His breath caught. The footage showed Richard helping the boys out of his car, walking them into the hospital with Natalie. There was a still frame of him wiping a tear from Jaden's cheek. "The footage was leaked to the press early this morning," Helen said gravely. "We suspect someone from Black's side orchestrated it." Richard's jaw tightened. "This is low, even for him." "Public sentiment is mixed," she added. "Some people see a grieving father, others see manipulation. We have to be careful how you handle yourself tomorrow." "I understand." But Richard didn't fully understand, not until a few hours later when he received a letter. It was from Natalie's cousin, Arthur Black, the man petitioning for custody. The envelope was elegant, the handwriting sharp. Inside was a single sheet. "You think money can buy back what you abandoned. The court will see through your little performance. Blood means nothing when you've been a ghost for a decade." Richard read it 3 times before folding it slowly, deliberately. Later that evening, the boys returned from school with stories of science experiments and playground adventures. Richard listened, laughing softly at their dramatic reenactments of a baking soda volcano. But after dinner, Jacob grew quiet. "Is it true?" he asked, poking at his pasta. Richard looked up. "Is what true, buddy?" "Some kids said we're only here so people like your company again." Jaden stiffened beside his brother. Richard leaned forward, carefully. "No. You're here because I found you, and once I did, I knew I was never letting go. No company, no money, no reputation, none of that matters more than you two." Jacob looked up slowly, and the fear in his eyes was deeper than any 9-year-old should carry. "Even if people say bad things about us?" "Especially then," Richard said, his voice thick. "I'll be right there beside you." That night, Richard sat in Natalie's hospital room. She looked weaker, her face pale, her breaths shallow, but her spirit, somehow, still burned through her eyes. "They're saying things," he began quietly. "I know," she replied, barely above a whisper. "Arthur's good at spinning truth into poison. "I'm afraid," he admitted, "not of the court, but of failing them. Again." Natalie turned her head slowly, looking at him with something that wasn't judgment, but wasn't forgiveness either. It was something more complex, more human. "Then don't fail them. Be better. No more excuses." Richard nodded solemnly, reaching for her hand. "Will you be well enough to write something for the judge?" he asked gently. She smiled faintly. "Already did. Ruth has it." The next morning dawned overcast, the sky dim and uncertain. Richard adjusted his tie in the mirror, pausing when he caught sight of the drawing Jacob had left on his nightstand. 3 stick figures again, this time with the word Dad scrawled in blocky letters under the tallest one. At the courthouse, Helen met him at the steps. "We have the letter from Natalie. It's strong, personal. She left nothing unsaid." Inside, the courtroom was packed. Media cameras had been banned, but the energy buzzed with unspoken drama. Arthur Black sat across the aisle, smug and polished, flanked by a legal team that looked more like a firing squad. The judge entered, expression unreadable. The hearing began. Arthur's attorney spoke first, painting Richard as an absentee, a businessman using 2 vulnerable boys to sanitize a murky legacy. The words stung, but Richard didn't flinch. He sat straight, jaw set, eyes forward. Then Helen stood. She presented photos, letters, timelines, and finally Natalie's handwritten letter, read aloud to a room that fell breathlessly still. "To the Honorable Court, Richard Bennett is not perfect, but he is their father. I watched him step into their lives with clumsy tenderness and fierce resolve. He's earned a place in their world, not with money, but with presence. I trust him. Please let them stay where they belong." There was a long silence after. Then the judge turned to Richard. "Mr. Bennett," she said, "do you have anything to say before I make my decision?" Richard rose slowly. "I can't rewrite the past," he began, voice raw but steady. "I failed Natalie. I failed to be present when it mattered most. But I won't fail them, not now. They're my sons. I didn't choose to be a father, but now that I am one, I choose them, every single day." Jaden and Jacob, seated beside Ruth, looked up at him with wide, hopeful eyes. "I don't ask for a second chance to fix my image," Richard added. "I ask for a second chance to build a family." The courtroom was silent, and in that stillness, the weight of truth hung heavy, but not unbearable. Not anymore. The judge's gavel rested motionless, her eyes scanning the room. The walls of the courtroom felt too tight, too silent. Richard's words still hovered in the air like smoke from a candle just snuffed out, tender, irreversible, and aching with meaning. Jacob leaned slightly against Jaden, small hands clasped nervously in his lap. "I've reviewed the testimonies, the materials provided by both sides, and the letter written by Ms. Natalie Williams," the judge finally began, her tone deliberate, as if each word carried the weight of a future hanging in the balance. "Custody battles involving children are never simply legal matters. They are matters of love, of stability, of trust. These boys deserve a home where they feel protected and genuinely wanted." Richard's chest tightened. He resisted the urge to reach for the boys from across the room. His palms itched to hold them, to say, "It's okay now." The judge exhaled softly. "In light of the evidence and Natalie's own wishes, I hereby grant full custody of Jaden and Jacob Williams to Mr. Richard Bennett." A gasp rippled through the crowd. Then silence. Then Jaden stood up so fast his chair clattered behind him. He bolted across the courtroom before anyone could stop him and threw his arms around Richard's waist. Jacob followed, stumbling over his untied laces, and wrapped himself around Richard's leg. Richard dropped to his knees, breath catching in his throat. He held them tightly, as if someone might try to take them away even now. We get to stay with you? Jaden whispered. You're not going anywhere, Richard replied hoarsely. You're home. Ruth dabbed her eyes with a tissue. Even Helen, usually composed and reserved, blinked more than usual. The judge gave a small, private smile. Court adjourned. As people filed out, murmurs of sympathy and quiet celebration filled the space. Arthur Black didn't speak. He stormed out, shoulders rigid, his plans shattered. But Richard didn't notice. His world had narrowed to the two boys still clinging to him like lifelines. Outside the courthouse, a brisk wind blew through downtown Houston. News cameras flanked the steps, their lenses hungry for a headline. Richard held a boy in each arm, shielding them, as Helen stepped forward to speak on his behalf. We will not be making further statements today. Mr. Bennett's only concern is the well-being of his children. We ask the media to respect their privacy. When they reached the car, Jaden looked up, his eyes solemn. Can we tell Mom? Richard hesitated. We'll go see her right now. Natalie was awake when they entered the hospital room, though her breathing was shallow. Her skin looked thinner, like tracing paper, but her eyes sparkled when the boys ran to her bedside. Guess what? Jacob said breathlessly. We get to stay with Dad. She smiled, a weary but radiant smile, and held their hands tightly. Thank you, she whispered to Richard, her voice barely audible, for keeping your promise. Richard sat beside her, taking her hand with reverent care. They chose me, Nat. I just showed up. They did the rest. Her eyelids fluttered. I can rest now, knowing they'll be okay. He blinked against the burn in his eyes. You gave them everything. All I'm doing is learning to catch up. No, she murmured. You gave them hope. The boys fell asleep in the chairs by her side, their heads leaning on each other, unaware that time was growing short. Later that evening, after tucking the boys into bed back at the penthouse, Richard stood by the window, city lights glowing like scattered fireflies. He held Natalie's letter again in his hands, rereading it in the quiet. Let them laugh, Richard. Let them build things, break things, ask questions, and stay up past bedtime sometimes. Let them know love doesn't have to be earned. It's simply given. That's all I ever wanted for them. He placed the letter in a small glass frame and set it on the fireplace mantel beside a new drawing the boys had made. 3 stick figures under a house with a giant heart above them. A family. That night, when Jacob woke from a bad dream, Richard was already there, rubbing his back gently. Was it the monsters again? Richard asked softly. Jacob nodded into the pillow. Well, Richard said with a yawn, lying beside him, good thing you've got a dad now. Monsters don't stand a chance. Jacob smiled sleepily. Can we have pancakes tomorrow? I'll try not to burn them this time. You always burn them, Jaden mumbled from the other bed. Yeah, but they're still kind of good, Jacob added. Richard chuckled quietly, wrapping an arm around the boy. We'll make it work. He didn't know if he'd ever fully forgive himself for the years he'd lost, the silence he'd mistaken for closure. But tonight, with his sons safe in his arms and their laughter echoing faintly down the hall, Richard Bennett knew one thing with absolute certainty. He would never let go again. The air was still in the garden behind Richard's estate, still and heavy, as though even the trees mourned. Spring had crept in, but today it felt like autumn. A quiet hush settled over the small group gathered around a modest circle of stones, where white lilies and forget-me-nots framed a delicate wooden bench. Natalie's memorial was not extravagant, not gilded or formal. It was intimate, exactly the way she had lived. Soft, deliberate, meaningful. Jaden and Jacob each held a sunflower in their small hands. Richard stood behind them, one hand gently resting on each of their shoulders. They'd asked him what to say, and he'd simply replied, "Whatever your heart wants her to hear." Jaden stepped forward first. His voice trembled, but he stood tall. "Mom, thank you for fighting for us, for teaching us how to be kind, for every bedtime story, even when you were tired, and for believing we'd find someone who'd love us if you couldn't stay." His voice cracked. "We did, and he loves us a lot." Jacob, tears already sliding down his cheeks, followed. "I miss you, Mom, but I'm not scared anymore. Dad makes pancakes. They're kind of bad, but we eat them anyway. You'd laugh. He even burned his hand once." A soft ripple of laughter moved through the small circle. Richard knelt between them, holding back the emotion that surged like a wave in his chest. Then he stood, facing Natalie's simple marker, engraved with her name and the words, "A mother's love never fades." "I don't know if I deserved the second chance you gave me," he said quietly, more to her than to anyone else, "but I promise you, I won't waste it. I'll raise them with your heart inside mine." The boys placed their flowers carefully beside the stone. Jacob leaned against Richard's leg. "Do you think she hears us?" Richard looked toward the sky, where a shaft of light broke through the clouds, casting soft gold on the memorial stone. "I do," he said, voice thick with certainty. "I think she always will." Later that afternoon, back inside the house, Ruth stood in the kitchen drying dishes while the boys chased each other around the living room. Their laughter, so free and bright, felt like music she hadn't heard in years. Richard poured 2 cups of tea and handed one to Ruth. "You've been here every step," he said sincerely. "I don't think I would have made it without you." She smiled, touched. "You made it because you chose to show up, when it was hardest. That's the difference." He glanced toward the living room, where Jacob was now trying to ride a cushion like a horse while Jaden gave orders. "They're going to need stability, structure, and love," Ruth added pointedly, "which, thankfully, you've got in abundance now." There was a pause before she added, "Have you told them about the adoption paperwork?" Richard's heart fluttered. "I've been waiting for the right time." As if summoned by fate, Jaden bounded into the kitchen just then, cheeks flushed. "Dad! Jacob says he gets to pick tonight's movie because I picked last time. But I think—" Richard raised a hand gently. "Before we get into movie negotiations, can I tell you both something first?" Jacob peeked in from the hallway, curiosity written across his face. "What is it?" Richard crouched down. "I've been working with a judge and some lawyers to make sure that what we have now never changes." Jaden tilted his head. "What do you mean?" "It means," Richard said, his voice slow and thick with emotion, "I'd like to adopt you, both of you, officially, if you want me to." Jacob gasped. "Like, forever?" Richard nodded. "Forever." Jaden flung himself forward so hard that Richard almost lost his balance. Jacob wrapped around him too, tight and wordless. "You're already our dad," Jacob whispered into his chest, "but now the papers will know too." A week later, they stood in family court again, but this time it wasn't a battle. It was a celebration. Papers were signed, the boys were declared Bennetts in every legal sense, and when the judge offered to take a photo for the court's record, both boys insisted on sitting on Richard's lap, grinning ear to ear. The photo would later hang in the hallway of their home, right above a painting Jaden made in school titled "My Family is My Home." That evening, they sat around the dinner table, pizza boxes open, laughter echoing. Ruth told a story about Natalie from college, and Richard shared the time he accidentally signed a contract with a ketchup smudge on his tie because the boys surprised him with breakfast in bed. "Bet Mom would have thought that was funny," Jaden said, smiling at the ceiling. "I know she would," Richard said softly. As night fell and the house quieted, Richard tucked them into bed. Jacob clutched his stuffed dinosaur, and Jaden yawned into his pillow. "Good night, Dad," Jaden murmured. "Good night, my sons," Richard whispered back. He turned off the light, stepped into the hallway, and closed the door gently behind him. In the darkness of the hall, he leaned against the wall for a moment, relieved, overwhelmed, grateful. For the first time in decades, he didn't feel alone. He felt rooted, whole. Christmas lights twinkled from every window in the Bennett home, casting warm colors over the snow-blanketed yard. The boys had spent the morning building a crooked snowman they insisted was perfect, and Richard hadn't argued. It had one eye, no scarf, and its carrot nose leaned sideways. But to Jacob and Jaden, it was magic. Everything was magic now. Inside, the scent of cinnamon rolls wafted from the oven. Ruth hummed softly as she stirred hot chocolate, her presence as comforting as the wool blanket draped over the couch. The boys raced around with cardboard swords, their laughter echoing through the halls. Richard sat on the floor, sorting through ornaments. In his hand, he held a delicate snowflake carved from wood, the name Natalie etched in the center. His thumb brushed over it gently, reverently. He stood and crossed the room to the tree, finding a branch near the top. "This one goes where we can all see it," he said, mostly to himself. "Is that Mom's?" Jaden asked quietly from behind him. Richard turned. "It is. I made it for her our first Christmas together. She used to say it reminded her that no two snowflakes are alike, but each one has a purpose." Jacob climbed onto the couch to get a better look. "She'd like it here." Richard smiled, but there was a weight in his eyes. "Yeah, I think she would." The doorbell rang just then, unexpected, sharp. Ruth glanced at Richard, who was already moving toward the door, instinctively protective. Through the peephole stood a figure he hadn't seen in years. Eleanor, his sister, crisp and uninvited as ever. He opened the door slowly. "You're early for Christmas, Ellie." Eleanor brushed snow from her perfectly tailored coat. "And you're impossible to reach. I had to see it with my own eyes." Richard stepped aside without a word, allowing her in. The warmth of the house made her stiff posture look all the more misplaced. She took in the living room, the stockings, the boys' drawings on the walls, the traces of a life she hadn't imagined for him. Him. "Charming," she said, voice tight. "What do you want?" Richard asked flatly. "I heard," she said, setting down her designer bag. "About Natalie, about the twins, about your adoption stunt." His jaw clenched. "It wasn't a stunt." "No, because it's certainly been in every paper. CEO redeemed through fatherhood." "Your board is concerned. Investors are whispering." Richard folded his arms. "Let them whisper." Eleanor stepped closer, lowering her voice. "You walked away from Natalie once, Richard. I helped you clean up that mess, remember? And now you're painting yourself as some savior?" "Don't," Richard warned, his tone low. "Don't pretend you ever supported her. You were part of the reason she left." She blinked. "You're blaming me?" "I'm blaming both of us. But at least I'm trying to make it right." The boys appeared in the hallway, peeking around the corner. Richard softened. "Go upstairs, guys. I'll be there soon." "But," Jacob began. "Please," Richard added gently. Reluctantly, they obeyed. Eleanor followed his gaze. "You're serious about this?" "I'm not playing dress-up, Ellie. This is my family now." Eleanor hesitated, then sighed, frustration melting into something closer to disbelief. "You always had a stubborn heart, Richard. I never expected it would lead you here." He studied her. "What did you expect? That I'd stay bitter? That I'd die alone in a mansion full of regrets?" She didn't answer. Instead, she looked around one more time, then reached into her coat pocket and pulled out a small box. "I found this in Dad's old desk last month. I was going to keep it. But maybe you should have it." Richard opened the box slowly. Inside, nestled in velvet, was a letter, folded and yellowed with time. He unfolded it carefully, his breath caught. It was Natalie's handwriting. "Dear Richard, if you're reading this, it means something and you remembered me. Not just the pain, but the love, too. If we ever meet again, I hope you're kind to yourself and to them. They'll need your strength, your laughter, your stubborn heart. Love, Natalie. He closed his eyes. The room faded for a moment. When he opened them, they were glassy with unshed tears. "Where did you get this?" he asked, voice thick. Eleanor looked uncomfortable. "I don't know how it got into Dad's things. Maybe she mailed it. Maybe he kept it from you." That thought stung, but Richard didn't press. He folded the letter reverently, held it to his chest. "I was wrong," Eleanor said quietly. "You don't need saving from this. You needed them." He looked at her, tired but calm. "They saved me first." She nodded once, awkwardly. "I should go." "Stay for dinner," he offered, surprising them both. Eleanor blinked. "You sure?" "Ruth's cooking," he said with a faint smile. "There'll be leftovers." A soft laugh escaped her. "Then I guess I'll stay." As she hung up her coat and followed him into the kitchen, the smell of cinnamon and cocoa surrounded them like memory. In the hallway upstairs, Jaden and Jacob whispered through the cracks of their bedroom door. "Do you think she's staying?" Jacob asked. "Maybe," Jaden said, hopeful. "Maybe we're all starting over." They climbed into bed, the sound of laughter drifting upward. Below them, the family they never expected was beginning to take root, piece by honest piece. And, for the first time in a long time, Christmas didn't feel cold at all. The scent of pine and fresh-baked cinnamon rolls filled the Bennett house that Christmas morning. Outside, snow blanketed the garden like powdered sugar, undisturbed except for 2 sets of small footprints zigzagging beneath the frosted windows. Richard stood in the kitchen, holding a chipped mug the boys had insisted he use, painted sloppily with the word Dad in blue finger paint. His hand cradled it gently, as though afraid to disturb something fragile and sacred. Sunlight spilled across the countertops, illuminating the faint lines in his face, less from age, more from the years spent running from what mattered. Now, he wasn't running. He was rooted. Jacob barreled down the stairs in fuzzy reindeer pajamas. "Dad, you can't open anything until we're all in the living room," he declared, breathless and bossy in the way only 9-year-olds could be. "I was just checking the cinnamon rolls," Richard replied, mock innocent. "You say that every 5 minutes?" Jaden teased, appearing behind his twin with a box tucked under his arm. Richard smiled. "That's because they smell too good to ignore." Together, the three moved toward the living room, where the tree stood tall and glowing with gold and silver lights. Ornaments clinked softly when the boys brushed against the branches. Beneath the tree, carefully wrapped presents waited, but it was clear from their eager eyes that this morning was about something much bigger than gifts. Ruth sat on the couch with a knitted shawl and a knowing smile. She had become more than a caretaker. She was family now, folded into their world with the quiet grace of someone who understood how to love with action more than words. On the mantel, next to Natalie's snowflake ornament, sat a framed photo of her, young, vibrant, eyes full of quiet mischief. Beside it, 2 recent photos, one of the boys holding hands in front of their school, and another of Richard crouched beside them, arms draped around their shoulders, all 3 mid-laugh. Jacob tapped Richard's arm. "We have something for you, but you have to sit." Richard raised a curious brow but obeyed. "Okay, I'm ready." Jaden handed over the box carefully, wrapped in silver paper and tied with an uneven red bow. "We made it ourselves," he said proudly. Richard pulled the ribbon loose and opened the lid slowly. Inside, nestled in layers of tissue, was a drawing. Crayon and marker, messy and vibrant. It showed 3 figures standing in front of a Christmas tree. 2 small boys, wide-eyed and grinning, and a man between them, tall with kind eyes. Above them, written in careful block letters, "Family Forever." Richard didn't speak for a moment. He simply stared. chest rising unevenly. "I drew it," Jaden said softly, but Jacob picked the words. "Mom always said family is who stays," Jacob added, suddenly shy, "and you stayed." Richard swallowed hard, emotion cresting in his throat. He looked at the boys, his sons, in every way that mattered. "Thank you," he whispered, voice thick. "This is the best gift I've ever received." They both lunged forward, wrapping their arms around his neck, holding on tightly. Richard held them close, heart full in a way he never thought possible again. Ruth dabbed at her eyes discreetly. "All right. Now who wants cinnamon rolls?" The boys shot to the kitchen like rockets, but Richard stayed behind for a moment longer. He stood and approached the mantel, gently placing the drawing beside Natalie's snowflake ornament. Then, almost as if speaking to her photo, he murmured, "They're safe. I promise." That night, after cocoa and carols and more laughter than their house had ever known, the three curled up on the couch beneath a patchwork quilt Natalie's mother had made long ago. The fire crackled softly, casting flickering light across their faces. Jacob, half asleep, mumbled, "Dad, can we do this every year?" Richard smoothed his hair gently. "Every year, forever." Jaden nestled closer. "Even when we're big?" Richard chuckled quietly. "Especially then." Silence fell, a silence that wasn't empty, but full. Full of second chances, of love reborn, of memories honored and futures claimed. Outside, the snow began again, gentle as breath, blanketing the world in fresh possibility. Upstairs in a quiet drawer, Richard had tucked away the last letter Natalie had ever written. He hadn't shown it to the boys yet. He would, someday, when the time was right. For now, her words lived through them, through the way they smiled, argued, and trusted again. The fire burned low, the boys' breathing slowed. And Richard Bennett, once the loneliest man in a skyscraper of success, finally understood the simplest truth. Love doesn't vanish. It waits, sometimes through years, sometimes through pain, but always with the hope of return. And this time, he hadn't missed it.